So as I was saying at the very outset, today's going to be wrapping up Kierkegaard. We're going to move on, I guess, despite his advice, I suppose, right? We're not going to stop at faith, I suppose. Well, we're going to move on to other things besides faith. In fact, and maybe here's another thing too. I said that next meeting we're going to look at Bertrand Russell's essay. We might, since this is the only representative, I suppose, of a religious approach to existence, maybe if we have time, if we get through the Bertrand Russell fast enough, maybe I'll spend a little bit of time next week talking about different approaches to meaning, the meaning of life in religion. So we'll talk about more, I guess, more, what's the word I'm looking for? More orthodox or common understandings of the major religions, not the Kierkegaardian Christianity, but your typical run-of-the-mill everyday Christian today. How do they typically see life and the meaning of it? We'll talk about maybe Buddhism and some other religions or something, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because this is not really a class on the philosophy of religion. But I feel that since pretty much everybody from here on out is secular at best and atheistic at the extremities, I suppose, maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the other religious understandings of life and what our purpose is in it. But today we're going to, like I said, wrap up Kierkegaard. A lot of it's just review, but once I'm done sort of reviewing and kind of refreshing our memory, giving a sort of broad outline of the story so far, I'm going to fill in some of the details. This shouldn't take too long, though, I think. And as I said, this might be a short meeting. We'll see. I don't want to set myself up and make promises I can't keep. And then again, too, we might have some class discussion. And if there's a lot of, interest and talk, then, of course, we can extend things. But I believe this is maybe one of the first things I said about Kierkegaard. We went over, let me back up here and see yeah, that's right. Yeah, we were talking about meaning on the first day and got into language games and Wittgenstein. And then when I jumped into Kierkegaard, I just sort of mentioned, look, this guy was obsessed with existence. In fact, he is often referred to as the father of existentialism. That's a bit of a inaccuracy. The existentialists, if you want to get technical, that was like a French intellectual movement from after World War I that started and continued to after World War II. And I suppose Camus, who we'll be reading later this semester, is more appropriately called an existentialist, even though he himself kind of shunned the title. But Kierkegaard, certainly his philosophy focused on what he called existence and how we approach existence. And we're talking about human existence here. For him, there are basically three perspectives, three ways in which human beings engage with their existence. We can't help but fall into one of these patterns. And the first two are the most common. The religious, obviously, is something special for him. And the story of Abraham is supposed to encapsulate as best as possible what a religious form of existence would look like. And I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to expand on this a little bit. This is stuff that's not in the reading, but later today, once we get through this review, I'm going to add a few details to the story. But basically, you've got the aesthetic approach, which says, I want to make life interesting. I want to have fun. The two major values, the two major categories, I suppose he probably used the word category, Kierkegaard, of existence in this framing would be the categories of interesting and boring. Everything is understood or valued in these terms. So we have the example of the seducer that I brought up and that Kierkegaard uses, who is seducing the young woman and gets her to fall into his trap, basically, so that he can just sort of sit back and watch all the pieces fall into place. This is something I believe I emphasized last time, that the aesthetic in this mode, our focus is to be. We just, being is the key. We want to just not overthink things and just kind of enjoy, almost be like a pleasure receptacle. This is a very tricky dance, though. And this is one of the criticisms that Kierkegaard often levels against the aesthetic approach to existence, is that in order to just be, to sort of just sit back and enjoy the show, there's a lot of preparation that's involved. And so one has to be very reflective, which is kind of that's almost contradictory to what the goal is. The goal is to not be reflective at all. The goal is to just not think about stuff and just to sort of enjoy the party, to just enjoy the show. But when we read about the seducer in one of Kierkegaard's other books, the Either Or, one of his famous, one of his classics, probably his more popular book, Either Or. Much longer though. It's not something we could cover in a class like this. But in that book, you get the story of the seducer who, when everything's said and done, he gets to kind of chill, sit back and laugh and just sort of enjoy his handiwork, as he breaks this woman's heart. But leading up to that, there's a lot of, what Hegel would call mediation, rationalization, dialectic. He's got to think about, what do I say to her to get the reaction that I want? Who do I pair her with that she's going to fall for? And then I trick her, then I get her to fall for me. So as much as the aesthetic or the aesthete, the person who's living their life this way, as much as they'd like to just be, that's a really tough thing to do. There's a sort of dance they have to play. They have to organize and set up their life in such a way that it's as interesting as possible. So there's this kind of tension and almost contradiction inherent in the aesthetic. The ethical is probably the more common approach to existence. It's the one that we're sort of taught to follow. This is when we have a clear sense of values, a sense of right or wrong. We have a clear sense of self. There's no real sense of identity or self in the aesthetic approach. That's his argument, at least. We don't identify with anything for very long. We might pretend to for fun, but we don't have strong commitments to anything. We only like it if it's interesting. If it gets boring, we're out the door. And that's why the ethical is kind of the antithesis. You've got this insistence to hold on to a sense of self, regardless of whether things get boring. When I decide to get married, this is the perfect example that he often uses as the ethical type of existence, the married life, the married man, the husband, or the wife, right? However you want to think of it. They decide to make a commitment to this other person. And they've decided that I must act this way to be a good husband, to be a good wife, whatever it is. And so the focus in this sense then is not to be like in the aesthetic. I just want to sort of be and enjoy and just sort of get my kicks. But now the focus is to becoming. I've got a goal. I've got a focus. I've got an ideal, the perfect husband, the perfect wife, the perfect, artist or, businessman, whatever it is, entrepreneur, whatever sense of self I have, which is much stronger than in the aesthetic. Remember, the aesthetic, there really is no strong sense of identity or self. In the ethical, that's the key, that's the core. And now we get to the religious. And for Kierkegaard, this is one that requires a bit of a leap. And this is one that most people we don't really have the constitution for it. We're unwilling to be what we really are. That's one way that he puts it. In fact, I'm sort of foreshadowing where I'm going with this. Once we get through this and I start getting a new material, we're going to look more into this concept of despair, which is the flip side of faith. Faith is living the religious life properly and being who you truly are. Despair, which really in Kierkegaard's mind is synonymous with sin, despair is not being who you are, not truly being who you are. And the aesthetic and the ethical, they both fall into this despair in some sense, because I guess the aesthetic, I guess the way you might want to look at it is we want to be less than what we are. The aesthetic is sort of a brutish existence. You're no different than an animal. You know, what animals, you know, it's all about that, this is an old, I guess, characterization of animals that some of you might take issue with. And it's sort of couched obviously in his Judeo-Christian heritage, but animals are less than humans, right? Humans aren't quite animal, right? We're not quite gods, but we're not quite animal. We're in this sort of middle ground. And so Kierkegaard is arguing here that the aesthetic sort of is a lowering of our status. We want to just be an animal. We just want to just be, you know, the animals, when they have sex, they're not thinking about commitment. They're just thinking about it, they smell a certain scent, they hear a certain mating call or whatever it is, and then they run, you know, they just have kids, you know, and there's no thought of it. And that's the aesthetic is sort of trying to achieve that animalistic, direct attunement with one's base drives and animal desires. But we're better than that, right? We're better than that. But we're not gods either. And the ethical tries to make us into something more than what we are. We set up these values. Well, I'm going to be, you know, what do I think I should do? I'm going to be a husband that's really a good husband. That's where I'm going to get meaning in my life. And what is it to be a good husband? Well, let me think about, like, what would it be? We're like God up on Mount Sinai, and we're Moses at the same time. I'm sorry, I'm using biblical references, assuming y'all know. You know, when the Jews, or I guess they weren't called Jews then until the first time they were captured by the Babylonians, I think, were the ones that named them out of Jews because they were from Judah. They were the Hebrews, right? They were escaping Egypt. They were being guided by Moses, and they were in the desert for 40 years or something like this. And they struggled and struggled on the way back to the promised land. And Moses, made them stop off at Mount Sinai, where he had a conversation with God, right? Moses literally went up to the top of the mountain and God gave him the 10 commandments. He gives them these 10 rules, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's, wife, all this stuff. This is sort of the notion of the ethical, is the idea that we are able to be Moses and God at the same time. We are able to sort of just think our way to these universal ideals, and we're able to sort of justify ourselves universally to anybody that might ask. Now, every form of ethical might take on a different shade, but that's not how it seems to us. For us, these values are universal. So what I mean by that, one person's idea of an ideal marriage is going to be different from somebody else's idea of an ideal marriage. But we don't act that way when we're in this ethical mode. When somebody doesn't act within our sort of value, we sort of shake our heads and say, it's not right. Or when we don't live up to our own values, same thing. We put these standards on ourselves. Again, the aesthetic, the ethical, more than, less than what we are. What we are as human beings, we're in the middle of animals and gods. We're not gods that make rules for ourselves, nor are we these brutish beings. But we can find meaning somehow through faith and being transparently grounded in the power that established us. I'll write that phrase in a minute because we're going to come back to it once I get through all these other things I want to say about despair. But and I mentioned this in class last time. There's a way in which the religious mode of existence incorporates elements of both the aesthetic and the ethical, but it lacks the downfall of them, right? The aesthetic is unsatisfactory, right? What's going to happen if you live your life in the mode of the aesthetic? Eventually, you're going to get burnt out. You're going to be like, man, my life is meaningless. I just go from one adventure to the next, and there's no continuity. I've got no sense of identity, no sense of self, no sense of value, no sense of accomplishment, nothing to be proud of. It wears on the soul. So one moves towards the ethical. The ethical itself has its own pitfalls, namely time is the way that Kierkegaard puts it, but that's pretty vague. Why would he say time? Why is time the enemy of the ethical? Why is it so? Time is what gets in the way of living the ethical life and staying true to it. When one gets married, for instance, how does time get in the way?
It can affect, like, once the time is like going by, it can either turn to be good or bad.
Right. So when you're first married, we're assuming that you're happily getting married. That passion for your existence is going to be pretty high, right? So your ability to maintain that value, that system, that sense of self, your drive to do that is going to be very intense and very high. The longer you stay married, I suppose the argument is, the longer you stay married, the more time you're together, the harder it is to maintain that level of passion. You get used to this sort of mundane, cookie cutter, okay, every day I do the same thing. Every once in a while, you're like, man, why don't I just break the rules every once in a while? Why would I want to break the rules? Because I'm bored. And now I'm reverting back into the aesthetic mode of existence. So we tend to flip-flop between these two ways of being, of existing. We're either sort of checking out, what's going on and just sort of like not really committed to anything and just sort of like, well, I'm not really committed. I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to wait and see. And whatever's the most fun, I'll go with that. And then every once in a while, we're like, know what, man, I really care about this thing and I'm going to stick to it. And those two poles are these two poles of the ethical and the aesthetic that we just keep bouncing back and forth between. But the religious, again, is the most passionate form of existence. And this is where we actually desire something that's absolutely impossible, right? That's another thing, I guess. Let me, I'm going to copy and paste this slide. Give me a second here. Let me fill this in a little bit more, because there's some other distinctions we could draw between these three approaches to existence. So let me erase all this. One thing or one point that Kierkegaard will often make about our passions is that our passions are more intense the more distant we are from our goal. And so he thinks because of this, the aesthetic existence is the least passionate form of existence. And that kind of seems odd to say when you read the descriptions of the seducer, because you're like, well, that guy seems to be having fun and he seems to enjoy his seduction and gets a kick out of life. But remember, because the seducer or anyone who's living this aesthetic mode, they're not that attached to their object. And so if the seducer fails to seduce Cordelia, is that going to break his heart, you think? If there's a guy who's a player, some Don Juan player who's like always hooking up with chicks every day, he gets a new girl and they're all these hot, gets all the finest whatever. if he goes in one night and one of these girls disses him, is that going to really bother him, you think?
No, it's not.
No, right. Because it's like, so what? I wasn't that really attached. I don't really give a shit. Like, I was just I mean, it was interesting, but whatever. So when things don't work out, when the seduction fails, it's no big deal. They move on. So their goal is not something they're all that committed to, I suppose, right? But when you get to the ethical, right, the goal is pretty tough, right? So the ethical is much more passionate than the aesthetic, because you're the man or the woman, the person who gets married, they're like, man, I really, and this is a difficult goal to maintain a marriage. You know, what is it, 50% divorce rate? You know, it's even worse, I think now, like recently. So I mean, it's man, the odds are against you. Like it's possible, but the goal is, it's pretty far off. So there's be more passion and more commitment because it's something you really give a crap about. And if it fails and it doesn't work out, you're gonna feel bad about it. You're like, damn, I thought that was gonna work. It didn't. Shit. You know, so there's a lot more, but the religious is the most passionate because you want something that is not just difficult, you want something that's impossible. Abraham believes that he's going to keep Isaac, even though he's going to lose Isaac, whatever that means. It's a paradox, it's a contradiction, but yet he has to believe it. So because the religious is so impossible, it is the most, if you really believe it, you'll be even more passionate. I'm going to be actually reading some, I found this old textbook of mine that I used to have to use this when I was teaching at San Jacinto. And I remembered this morning, there's some good stuff in here on Kierkegaard. And one of the things that this wasn't actually planned, it just popped into my head, but there's one example he uses here that's a pretty good example. You know, he talks about how, you know, what if you're a student in a class who has a test the next day? And there are different ways that you might feel about the test. Let's say you don't really care about the class. Like, let's say maybe, you know, you don't even need the class to pass or something or whatever. Well, you're not going to feel all that nervous about it. You're not going to feel, there's not going to be that much intensity or passion involved in that experience. You might not even study for the test. You're like, you know, I don't even care about this class. Maybe I pass, maybe I don't. Who gives a crap? Let's say you're a student who actually does want to pass the class. You really want to do a good job. There's one of two scenarios. Let's say you've been to class every day. You've done all your homework. You feel more or less comfortable with the material. Well, you're still going to feel pressure and you're still going to want to pass the class, but you're going to feel more comfortable than somebody who, let's say they aren't that comfortable with the material. They're having a really big, a difficult time understanding it. They had to miss a few classes. They haven't been keeping up with the homework, but let's just pretend they have just as much desire to pass the class as the other student. They're still going to feel more urgency. They're still going to feel more intensity and more passion. And so the further the goal is away from you, the more distance between where you're at and where you want to be, where your goal is, the more passionate your existence. So this is one argument for why he thinks the religious existence is the most passionate, but it's also the most difficult. It's one of the hardest to, most of us don't want to take this leap. It requires us to give our best, the way Abraham was willing to give his best, to sacrifice his best. This is something I think that would really annoy Kierkegaard about a common conception, and he would say misconception of religion, particularly the Christian religion. I remember a few years ago, maybe some of you remember when Tiger Woods was having his little controversy with I guess he got caught cheating on his wife or something, you know, and then it turns out he had all these mistresses, you know, and they were like porn stars. I mean, it didn't really look good for the guy because he was trying to, I think, project this kind of wholesome goody two shoes family man kind of persona. So when that came out, he was having some issues in his life, obviously, and I think he was going to, like, what was it, rehab for sex addiction or whatever the hell. But I remember when that was going on, there was this commentator. His name is Britt Hume. And I don't mean to pick on the guy. I honestly don't like him too much, but I don't mean to pick on him. But he got in trouble for this. And hey, I don't think he really should have gotten in trouble for it. It's his personal opinion. I don't agree with it. What the hell? But he said something that really would have probably pissed off Kierkegaard. And you hear a lot of religious people say something similar about it. They express a similar sentiment. But what he said was this. He was talking about Tiger Woods. And he said, oh, I don't know. I'll do my best Brit Hume imitation. He says, I don't know much about Buddhism, but I heard that Tiger Woods is a Buddhist. I really don't know much, so I can't comment on that. But my advice to him is that in this time of trouble, that he should give his heart to Jesus Christ, because I'm a Christian and I know that if he gives his heart to the Lord, then that will help him. That will help him through this difficult time. That will alleviate his suffering. That will make it easier on him. Now, I don't think Kierkegaard would have liked that one bit. Why not? What do you think Kierkegaard would say to that?
That's his relation, how he sees it to be. Not, he doesn't believe in the organized aspect of it.
Well, definitely, right? He doesn't like this sort of, well, I've got the prescription for you. Just take one pill of Jesus H. Christ, it's 2,000 IUs a day and you'll be good. Yeah, I think that's one thing. But what else, though? Is the religious existence the easiest? Does it make things easier? Is being Abraham easy? No. No, for him, it's the hardest. It is the most difficult. And this is why Abraham is silent, just like Johannes is silent. He can't talk to Sarah about what he's about to do. There is no way to express it in terms of the ethical. There's a passage from Fear and Trembling that we're not going to get to, but he mentions, I think it's a passage from Matthew, the book of Matthew. It might be Luke, I don't remember, but it's one of the first four gospels. It says something like, you will hate your mother and father before me. You will hate your brother and sister before me. And a lot of people, a lot of religious Christians, the way they do with the Abraham passage, they kind of gloss over that part, or they kind of ignore it, or just don't even talk about it, because it just kind of sounds, why would Jesus want you to hate your brother and your mother and your sister or whatever? What Kierkegaard thinks this means is that when you find faith, like Abraham did, it makes you hate your brother, your sister, because there's no way you can relate to them. It's not that you hate the relation because you're like, geez, I wish I could express to them why this is the case, but there's no way to express it in ethical terms. There's no way to express it in rational terms. There's nothing that Abraham could say to Sarah to console her about what he's about to go do, to go to the Mount on Moriah. And so that's why it's like, I hate the mother, I hate the, of course he still loves his family, but it's this sort of like this, I wish I could just talk to them about this, but if I tried to explain to them, it'd probably make them more mad, and they'd try to, maybe Sarah would be like, are you sure it was God talking to you? Maybe you're going crazy. Maybe the devil was trying to convince you. I thought I saw a hand go up. Was that Dania that wanted to?
Yes,
yeah,
that was me. So it's more like, I feel like what you're trying to, what I'm understanding is that they both have different perspectives on that outlook. And Abraham is trying to get that person to see that outlook, but it's going to be like a difficult, complex solution to abide by, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose Abraham is like the most extreme example that one could imagine. I can't imagine a more extreme case. How are you going to explain to your wife that God wants you to kill your son? I mean, he doesn't know that it's just a test. He doesn't know that God's got a ram and that it's not really going to happen. He believes that he's going to kill Isaac and at the same time that he's going to keep Isaac. How does that work? That sounds crazy. It doesn't make any sense. It's a paradox. It's a contradiction. And so there's no way he can talk to Sarah about this. She's going to think he's nuts. So he's the most extreme case. I'm trying to make this more relatable because I don't think that Kierkegaard wants us to all be like, when we find our faith, we're not the father of faith. We're not Abraham. He's the most extreme case. It doesn't require that we have to go up and kill our kid or be willing to kill our kid or whatever, but it might require us to burn some bridges. It might require us to do things that upset some people in our lives. And we might do actions that are irreconcilable with any reasonable or rational explanation. There's this incommensurability he speaks of. He loves to use that word, incommensurability. When I have this faith, let's say I get married, and that's my faith, is faith in the one I'm in love with. I find this woman, she's the love of my life. And from that point on, now everything in my life gets value through my relationship to this woman. If at some point in my life, I'm called upon to murder for that woman, I might know that that's wrong, but I still do it because I know she's so important to me. I'm trying to think of a scenario where that might be necessary, right? But I don't know. Maybe it would be. I don't know. You have to murder somebody to save her because then she'll go to jail forever if they tell what she did. But you're like, no, I can't lose her, right? So you do things that are not. I mean, I'm thinking of an example from the Bible, just to sort of keep with Kierkegaard. If you know the story of Jonah and the whale. Jonah was called upon by God to go warn where was he going? Nineveh, right? God said, go to the Ninevites and tell the Ninevites to flee because they need to go. They need to escape because I'm going to destroy their land and all this stuff. And so Jonah was sent to Nineveh by God, but he didn't want to go. Why didn't he want to go? Well, the Ninevites were not Jewish. They were Goyim, right? They were not of the people. And so Jews were not supposed to mix with non-Jews, right? And so that would not fit their ethical, moral framework. That wouldn't fit the rule book. And so when Jonah hears that he's supposed to go, why do I care about the Ninevites? Screw them. I don't want to go to warn them. So Jonah tries to escape his destiny, and he gets on a boat and tries to sail as far away from Nineveh as possible. So God makes a big storm on the sea and screws everything up, because that's what happens when I guess for Kierkegaard, when God has a destiny for you. You're supposed to do this thing, and that's what your life is. That's what faith is. And Jonah didn't want to do it. He went and tried to escape his destiny to go to warn the Ninevites. And what ended up happening to Jonah? He ended up spending 40 days and 40 nights where? Who knows the story? He was in the belly of a whale, right? He goes out on the ocean and I don't think it's kind of fair because God makes all the people on the ship die too for helping Jonah. It's kind of like, and maybe that sort of represents that when you don't follow your true path, when you're not honest about yourself, when you try to be something more or something less than what you are, it doesn't just drag you down. It drags down everybody else around you, drags them down with you. It makes their life hell because you're not being true to yourself. Maybe you're putting on an act to please them, but it doesn't please them because it's an act and it's not authentic or whatever, right? So Jonah eventually learns his lesson and he goes to the Ninevites and he warns them and all that stuff, right? But it didn't make sense. Why would I do this? The Ninevites, it doesn't fit it doesn't make sense for why he should do this. And so there's something about that. The religious requires sacrifice, and it requires us to maybe, again, alienate ourselves from people when we don't want to. the way Andrew puts it, he was burdened by responsibility. Yeah, but it's not an ethical responsibility. It's like a religious responsibility to God, and it's so unique that it can't be couched in terms that others can understand. Right, and Joseph, yeah, we were talking earlier about the student preparing for the test. You know, he brings up maybe a better example, right? If you fail this class, maybe you lose your financial aid. Or I've had students, if they fail their class, they get deported back to the country they came from because they're like on a, you know, student fellowship, you know. So if you're in that situation, yeah, it's the pressure is on. But with the religious, right, that's the most passionate, because you realize, look, this is my best. And it's hard to be your best. There's a lot of pressure being your best all the time and giving your best and being authentic all the time and being real all the time. Most of us want to be in despair, right? But despair is sin, says Kierkegaard. So let's move on to that. I thought I'd be done early today, but it looks like maybe not. Let me get a new slide going here. So despair, you know, I defined it earlier as failure to be yourself. And he uses a lot of Christian terminology in some of his other works. So elsewhere, he'll equate sin with despair. So when you sin and you're in despair, it's the same thing. So that's kind of, you need to sort of wrap your mind around that terminology and get kind of familiar with it. Most of us, when we think of the word sin, it's sort of like you broke God's rule. You know, like God has a rule book that he makes with all these rules in it. And if you violate one of those rules, then you sin. But for him, it's a way of existing. You live in sin, I suppose. You might hear Christians. I remember my grandmother, my late great grandmother, may she rest in peace. She would always say that my cousins were living in sin. If they were living with their significant other, you know, their boyfriend or girlfriend, but they weren't married, you know, they're living in sin. You know? So sin is like, it's a state of being. Despair, it's a state of being. It's failing to be oneself. And Kierkegaard, or actually, I guess this is Johannes Climacus, and not getting too much of the details. He writes in The Sickness Unto Death that there are three types of despair. There is the despair, wait, which one do I want to do first? The despair of infinitude? Yeah, let's do that. Despair of infinitude. There's the despair of finitude. And then there's the despair of defiance. And under defiance, there's two types that we're going to get into. There's active and passive defiance. Okay, so let me back up here. So just again, remember, despair is failure to be oneself. Spell that correctly. Failure to be oneself. And all this stuff I'm getting from Sickness Unto Death. That's the name of the essay, The Sickness Unto Death. And I'm just going to I'm going to cheat here a little bit, and I'm just going to read. I mentioned earlier that I found this old textbook of mine that I used to teach out of. I'm actually going to read what Norman Melchert has written. Norman Melchert, the author of The Great Conversation, in his chapter on Kierkegaard. I'm going to read what he says, because he summarizes it pretty good, but I'll maybe expand a bit on what he says. So let's start with the despair of infinitude. So these are all different ways that we fail to be ourselves. The despair of infinitude. If I fall into this kind of despair, I lack finitude. So I lack limits. I lack finitude. I drift off into never, never land and become fantastic. My emotions slide into fantasy and a kind of abstract sentimentality. I absolutely melt with sympathy for suffering mankind, but I cannot stand my next door neighbor. My understanding becomes fantastic when it squanders itself in the pursuit of useless knowledge or in satisfying idle curiosity. I know all about the lives of the movie stars, but I don't care to know about the troubles of my roommate. My will fantasizes by building castles in the air. I am full of all the many wonderful things that I will do, but do not focus on the nearest act at hand that would move one step along the way, move me one step along the way. All of this is despair. All of this is not being willing to be myself. All this is sin. So yeah, I'm thinking myself of the person who buys a lottery ticket every day and just thinks about all the things they're gonna buy when they win the lottery, right? Like, maybe you're guilty of this. I'm not a big lottery player, but the despair of infinity, they just think of all these possibilities and they're not really honest. Like, yeah, sure, it's possible you could win the lottery, but they have everything down. They know exactly what kind of mansion they're gonna buy, what kind of car they're gonna buy, where they're gonna buy it, how many, I'm gonna have a private jet, but no, I'm not gonna have a private jet because I thought that through and it's too much to upkeep. It's actually cheaper to like rent the private jet whenever you need it. So like when I'm rich, I'll know how to do that. And then all these other rich people, like, and you got it all planned out. Like, dude, how are you going to become a millionaire? Just keep buying a lottery ticket every day? Your kids over there and they're having depression or anxiety, or they're failing classes, and you're over here thinking about the lottery and what you're going to do when you're a millionaire. And it's just sort of the dreamer in that sort of sense of the word, completely not in touch with reality, but they know everything about all the characters on their favorite soap opera. And they're very concerned about the characters on their favorite soap opera. And they're like, oh, geez, I hope Billy Bob marries Sue. I hope he doesn't leave her just because of that one thing she did. It's like, they're fictional fucking characters. And you haven't talked to your son in 5 years, or whatever, right? You get the point, right? So that's the despair of infinitude. What about the despair of finitude? Well, the short of this is the conformist. This is the person that lacks any imagination. The despair of infinitude, they're like, I'm going to win the lottery. I'm going to buy this and a boat and this and that. Oh, a boat's too much, but then that's too. But the finitude is like, what do you mean I get to choose my life? Don't I just do what everybody else does? Get married, have a kid, have a career, make money, have a nice house, live in the suburbs. This is sort of the cookie cutter existence. So falling into this kind of despair means I lack possibility, distance myself from myself, and from open vistas. I just go along with the crowd, doing what is expected, assuming that my path is already set by the others. And this is a long quote I'm going to read from The Sickness Unto Death. By seeing the multitude of people around it, by being busied with all sorts of worldly affairs, by being wise to the ways of the world, such a person forgets himself, in a divine sense forgets his own name, dares not to believe in himself, finds being himself too risky, finds it much easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, along with the crowd. Now, this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Precisely by losing oneself in this way, such a person gains all that is required for a flawless performance in everyday life. Yes, for making a great success out of life. Here, there's no dragging of the feet, no difficulty with his self and its infinitizing. He is ground smooth as a pebble, as exchangeable as a coin of the realm, right? A coin of the realm, right? I don't have any money on me. Nobody carries money anymore. But what's the difference between $1 bill and another? Not much. You can't tell the difference. They're indistinguishable. Far from anyone thinking him to be in despair, he's just what a human being ought to be. Naturally, the world has generally no understanding of what is truly horrifying. Yes, what we call worldliness simply consists of such people who, if one may so express it, pawn themselves to the world. They use their abilities, amass wealth, carry out worldly enterprises, make prudent calculations, etc. And perhaps they're even mentioned in history, but they are not themselves. So all this is despair. All this is not willing to be myself. All this is sin. I don't know if that needs much more commentary. That's, to me, the most straightforward of the despairs and probably the most common. This is just, again, they know people who live their lives without ever questioning anything. You know, they just sort of follow what their culture, their family, their religion, whatever it is, whatever they're prescribed to do, they do it, and they never give a moment's reflection on whether it's meaningful or valuable. It's just taken for granted. Well, of course, like, this is what everybody does. That's a cop-out. That's a failure to be oneself, says Kierkegaard. But what about the last one? What about the despair of defiance? He says we could perhaps light up this form of despair by, this is not Kierkegaard, this is again Melcher explaining Kierkegaard. There is a quote here though that I'll get to. He says, we can perhaps light up this form of despair by contrasting being willing, that's italicized, being willing to be oneself with willing to be oneself. What's the difference? In the latter, right, being willing to be oneself, that's Promethean, as he puts it. What's Prometheus? That's a word y'all don't know. Prometheus. Who is Prometheus? Anybody know Prometheus? I'll write the name in the chat box. Oh wait, I did that just to Leah. Sorry, I'll do it to everybody. Prometheus. No one's heard the story of Prometheus. So he was a Titan in the Greek myth. So he's one of the older gods, older than the Olympian gods. He stole fire from Olympus and gave it to human beings. And that pissed off all the gods. They were really mad that Prometheus gave humans fire. He rebelled. How dare you give fire to man? And so when the word Promethean is used, it's sort of like, wow, how arrogant. You're standing up to the gods. You're standing up to tradition. You're standing up to forces of nature. You're rebelling against nature. Prometheus was punished by the gods by being chained to a rock at the top of a cliff. And a hawk would come down and eat his guts out every day. And then at the end of the day, his guts would heal and the process would continue over and over again. Pretty gruesome, huh? You know, gods don't like to be. So what is Promethean about the despair of defiance? Well, we want to be gods. We make ourselves to a god, basically, is how he puts it here. There's some arrogance to this. The self, this is actually a quote from Kierkegaard from the Sickness Unto Death. And this is what he says. The self wants into despair to rule over himself or create himself, make this self the self he wants to be, determine what he will have and what he will not have in his concrete self. That is to say, he wants to begin a little earlier than other people, not at and with the beginning, but in the beginning. And that's in quotes, like the quote from the Bible, the very opening lines. In the beginning, God created the light and all that. He does not want to dawn his own self. He does not want to see his task in his given self. He wants to construct it in himself. And then he goes on, in the beginning is obviously a reference to the Bible. This one, I don't think he explains that well, so I need to comment on it a little bit, I think. So this is the again, making yourself your own God kind of thing. And, well, actually, hold on. He explains active defiance and passive defiance. So maybe maybe I should read that first before I jump in and try to correct him and flesh him out. So active defiance, and this is the more obvious, I think, case. And I have some good examples, I think, of this from my own life. I won't name names, but I can think of some characters like this. But in Act of Defiance, Melchert writes, "I will make myself whatever I want to be. I'm self-made. And if I don't like what I turn out to be, I'll become something else. In this mode, the self," and then he quotes Kierkegaard, "the self can at any moment start quite arbitrarily all over again. So far from the self succeeding in being itself, it becomes increasingly obvious that this is a hypothetical self. The self is its own master, absolutely its own master, and exactly this is the despair, but also what it regards as its pleasure and joy. It is easy on closer examination to see that this absolute ruler is a king without a country, that really he rules over nothing. His position, his kingdom, his sovereignty are subject to the dialectic that rebellion is legitimate at any moment. Ultimately, it is arbitrarily based upon the self itself. So consequently, the despairing self is forever building castles in the air." And then he gives a great example from an old sitcom. Most of you probably never even heard of it, but it was pretty famous back in the 50s. This old sitcom called The Honeymooners. But most sitcoms are kind of based on The Honeymooners. You had Jackie Gleason, who's this sort of buffoonish husband, and then the wife. And Jackie Gleason's character, his name is Ralph, and he mentions that. He says in the old television comedy, The Honeymooners, Ralph tells his wife, Alice, "Remember, I'm the king and you're nothing. I'm the king and you're nothing." And she always replies, "Big deal, king over nothing." Right? So it's kind of a joke, but this sort of encapsulates the despair of active defiance, and I still think this is kind of abstract, but it's kind of like, maybe you have friends like this. They want to be an artist, or they want to be an actor or actress, or they want to be something that they're not really that good at, and sometimes despite that, they succeed. I mean, hell, look at Keanu Reeves, sorry. I know a lot of y'all probably like, he's a popular guy. He seems like a really cool guy, to be honest. I actually like Keanu as a person. Every time I see him on interviews, I'm like, this dude seems like down to earth, seems cool, but I don't think he's that good of an actor. I think he was pretty good in Bill and Ted, but what's that?
You don't like The Matrix?
Oh no, I can't stand that movie. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because it was too hyped up for me. But when it came out, everybody would run to me and tell me how badass it was, and that I would like it because I'm into philosophy. And when I saw it, he's actually, somebody mentioned Point Break. He's pretty damn good in Point Break. Yeah, he's actually decent in there's a movie called Scanner Darkly that he's in, that's animated, and he does that pretty good. And I haven't seen a lot of his newer movies, so maybe his acting has gotten better. But I remember when he first, Daryl Hannah is another one. She's not that famous anymore, but I think Daryl Hannah was another actress who, she can't act, she might be a nice person, but whatever. I'm being really mean and naming names and all this. Someone mentions I think Mark Wahlberg is, I've only seen Mark Wahlberg in,
he's the same character in every movie.
Yeah, I guess you're right. He always plays like this badass macho.
Yeah, even his accent and everything. He's the same guy everywhere, it seems like.
But
he's overrated.
Plays it convincingly. Yeah, I think overrated. I'll give you that. He's overrated. But I thought he was good in The Departed. I thought he was pretty good in that. But you're right. He plays the same character in every film. It's this hot-headed macho, I've never seen Ted. I heard that's a really funny movie, though.
That's funny.
I kind of want to. That's with the teddy bear. That's real vulgar or whatever.
Yeah.
But back to defiance, active defiance, right? These are the people who are they're self-delusional. They're I don't know, man. I was about to say who it is, but somebody I know. They're always starting a new business and it always fails. And it's like, dude, you're not good at business. You suck. Although some of these guys, I don't know, the Mark Cubans of the world, a lot of times they'll tell you, I failed 50 times before I succeeded. So just keep failing. But some people just keep failing and they aren't cut out for business. I remember one of my classmates when I was in graduate school, she was, I guess she was like, yeah, I guess my lunch buddy. She was in a class of mine, and we would have lunch together after class. And she was real shy and real sweet girl, but it was kind of awkward because I was always talking. You know me, I never shut up, and she just never said anything. So I was always prodding her, trying to get her to open up. And I remember one day I was asking her why she decided to study philosophy. You know, I was like, wow, what made you decide you want to be a philosophy major? And again, real shy. She was like, well, I want to be a lawyer. I'm gonna go to law school. You know, I'm like, oh, cool, law school. Philosophy is a good really good pre-law degree. It's good for preparing you for law school for the LSAT. It's like, well, what made you want to be a lawyer? You know, why are you interested in the legal profession? And she's like, well, my dad wants me to be a lawyer. You know, my dad's a lawyer, my mom's a lawyer. They want me to be a lawyer, and it's sort of like I'm looking at her like, I don't think you're going to be that great of a lawyer. Like, I just don't think you have it in you, you know? And it's like, she's got this sort of plan in her head, like, go to law school, get the law degree, because that's what you're supposed to do to be a success. And then when I do that, and in a way, the more I talk about this, the more it's kind of sounding like the despair of finitude, like she's just fitting in with the crowd. But what makes me think of it as active defiance is that, to me, it's kind of obvious that she's not going to be cut out for legal work. She's not cut out for that kind of, maybe she'd be really good at other things. I don't know. I mean, she did have, I guess, kind of a wild side to her. I find out later she has a stripper pole in her bedroom. So I don't know. Maybe she's like, I don't know, you ever see that movie, Don't Be a Menace to South Central While Drinking Your Juice in the Hood? Where there's like a scene where I think Damon Wayans picks up this girl at the party, and she's all shy, just like my friend was just like this. She was like real quiet and shy and always had her head down. But then he like takes her home, and she's like a dominatrix. She's like, no, it's time to party. He's like, what the whoa, you know? So I don't know. Maybe she had that in her, and I just didn't see it. But certainly this is a type. You know, we've all probably done it. Maybe we've been it before, right? Where we were just in over our heads. We were kind of out of our element, but we denied it. We're like, no, I'm going to be the best baseball player there ever was, even though we got two left hands, you know? And it's like, no, you love baseball. You love the sport. Maybe you should be an announcer. Maybe you should be coach sports psychology. You can still be involved in the game. Maybe there's a place for you, but you're not a star athlete or whatever. But the active defiance is like, no, I could be anything I want to be, that kind of thing. So not truly being oneself. All right, we're running out of time, so I better finish up. Let me read. I'm going to continue reading here from the textbook, the Melchert book, the passive. What does he say about passive defiance? This one is, to me, I don't know if Kierkegaard meant this or if it's supposed to be this way, but to me, this one sounds very much like the night of infinite resignation. I don't really know if there's much of a difference. If anybody else, once I read this, if you have any comments on that, I'd be interested. But this sounds kind of like a version of the night of infinite resignation. This is the passive defiance. So Melchert writes, perhaps I find something objectionable about myself. I notice a flaw, perhaps in my character, perhaps in my physical constitution. And because of it, I'm filled with resentment. I'm offended. But I don't want to be changed or healed. Oh no, that would deprive me of my case against existence. Maybe this is slightly different than the infinite resignation. This is more like, I mean, you know, the example I gave last class of the French woman in the movie who fell in love and lost her love. I don't know, maybe it is kind of the same, but he mentions it's a flaw, something in your character, your physical constitution. You know, maybe you're like, well, I could be an actress, I would be an actress, but I'm brunette and they want blondes. There's too many brunettes. And if it weren't for the fact that I'm blonde, maybe that's a bad example because you could always dye your hair. I don't know. I'm tall and they want short women, right? If you're a woman, I guess they want you to be short. If you're a guy, they want you to be tall. Of course, Tom Cruise is like 5 foot, whatever the heck, you know. and he's still a star. But a lot of times they put, like when they're filming, they'll put those actors on blocks so they're standing up, like so they look taller than the women when they really aren't or whatever. But you get the point, right? You're making excuses for yourself. Like maybe you're just not cut out to be an actor, right? Or maybe you're just not cut out to be an artist. But you're like, well, the reason I'm not successful as an artist is because I'm not a woman or a Latina. You know, if I was a woman or Latina, there's all these women artist exhibits and Latino artist exhibits, and it's all hip and cool. But the fact that I'm just some white guy from Brooklyn or wherever I'm from or whatever, that's why I can't make it in the art world. Well, maybe your art just sucks. Like maybe, you know, maybe that is part of it. And there, but a lot of times it's because you're trying to do something but you're using this as an excuse. You're kind of like, well, if it weren't for this one thing is getting in the way. My life could have meaning, it could have purpose, but this one thing is getting in the way, and it's not my fault. It's beyond I can't change the state of things. So alas, here I am. But anyways, I'm rambling on. I told you guys I'd be done early, and here we are at 12:41 with only 4 minutes to kill. So I'm going to stop it there. Let me go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording so we're not recording anymore.